Today we'll be talking about just a few of the many movements, artists, and styles that make up the beginning of the Modernist period. This is a very loose and nebulous title that, as I said, accounts for quite a few movements. Due to a huge shift in society at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th, we see an explosion of different styles that are hard to categorize under one unified movement or umbrella, so we will be looking at things chronologically. Here's a list of some important terms and people for the movements we'll be covering today. Feel free to pause the video now and write some of them down to use in your Unit 7 reflection. Let's do a quick review of what was going on at the end of the 19th century. I talked about this during the last lecture video, but some of the movements we'll be looking at today occurred at the same time or in conjunction with the post-impressionists. Remember that this was a period of mass industrialization, which sped up the pace of society in general. More inventions were being created, more things were being mass-produced, people were buying more of these mass-produced items, and traveling more too. During this time we see a surge in new, innovative forms of architecture, not just in painting. In addition, world exhibition fairs of technology, art, and culture became common and widespread as a way for nations to show off their innovations. All in all, the industrialization of society led to further urbanization, the growth of cities and the mass migration of people to cities, which led to more industrialization with access to a larger workforce, and so on and so forth. To people at the time, it felt like an era of endless progress. The Crystal Palace is a great example of the architectural innovations that were being made in the late 19th century in the pursuit of perfection. It was constructed for the specific purpose of housing the great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations in 1851, an international exhibition meant to showcase scientific and cultural achievements. The invention of sheet glass and the widespread use of cast iron allowed for this towering building to support its own weight while having an entirely glass exterior. It was, at the time it was built, the largest enclosed space that had ever been built, at 1,851 feet long. 6 million people went to visit the technological marvel when it was first unveiled. Though the Crystal Palace was only a temporary installation, more permanent architecture in the modern style popped up as well. This library in Paris has a variety of influences. For example, the repeated arches coming down to sharp points recall Gothic architecture, while the dome shapes, complete with oculus, are clearly inspired by classical architecture. However, the exposed building materials immediately indicate the building's modernity. Cast iron and glass. The intricate lattice work of the metal also is inspired by the Art Nouveau movement, which we talked about last class, a style that drew from delicate forms of nature such as insect wings, plants, and other animals. The Chicago School was the first big architectural school in America, based in Chicago. Chicago was a hub of commerce for the Midwest and became a very wealthy city by the 1890s. The Chicago School aimed to accommodate the growing and changing cityscape with more practical and modern architecture. In laying the foundation for modern urban spaces, the Chicago School was also responsible for designing and creating the first skyscrapers. Sullivan, the designer, followed the model of form follows function. Thus, we see the beginning of simplifying and removing decoration from the facade of buildings to give them a more minimalist aesthetic. This building still has some decorative molding, but a few decades later in the 20th century we see a move towards complete minimalism. The concept of parks originated thousands of years ago in China, as private recreation and hunting grounds for nobles. They remained largely for the elite up until the industrial era in Europe. At the beginning of the 20th century, we see the emergence of public urban parks, prompted by the pollution and overcrowding of cities caused by the Industrial Revolution. The first of these was in Germany, and by the mid-1800s, plans were being drawn up for the construction of Central Park in New York City, a sprawling park in the middle of the bustling metropolis with walking and carriage paths, ice skating ponds, flower gardens, playgrounds, fountains, and several cross streets for traffic. Though not often considered a part of the artistic movements of the 19th century, the creation of public urban parks was very important for industrialized society, and many of these spaces would become settings for modern installation art in the 20th century. Now that we've talked about the major architectural innovations of the 19th century, let's review a little bit of the painting from this time to look at how it inspired the early modern movements of the 20th century. During the last lecture, we talked specifically about Cézanne and Van Gogh as major precursors to the Expressionist movement. This is a movement that started in Germany in the early 20th century but spread to all of Europe and eventually America and other parts of the world. The Expressionists emphasized the bold use of color and form to express emotions and a subjective view of the world. Cezanne and Van Gogh, who both used color in a way that relied less on naturalism and more on evoking a feeling or mood, were huge inspirations for this movement. They also both had highly structured styles, seen through their heavy application of paint and thick brushstrokes. Unlike the Impressionists, they wanted to bring rigor and form back into art, but without the naturalism of the previous movements. Though these artists are considered post-Impressionists, their work paved the way for Expressionism. It's also important to look at socio-historical context for Expressionism and every other movement that emerged at the beginning of the 20th century. This era was one of upheaval and disruption of the peace and societal progress that had taken place over the last half a century or so. People soon realized that this era of prosperity was coming to an end with the onset of World War I. This war, which pitted the Allies, Britain, France, Russia, and eventually the United States, against the Central Powers, Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, completely transformed Western society. A war-torn France, the setting for much of the fighting, demanded huge reparations from Germany. The country went bankrupt and dealt with widespread famine as a result. The United States, in contrast, entered a period of economic prosperity known as the Roaring Twenties. At this time, we see the emergence of several warring ideologies that future wars would be fought over: communism, fascism, and liberal democratic capitalism. Despite the massive conflict taking place in so much of the world, Europe and America continued to see a great amount of technological progress. Inventions such as the first powered flight and the mass production of vehicles made travel easier and more accessible, while innovations in warfare technology made World War I one of the deadliest wars in history. People became more aware of society and life in other corners of the world with the invention and improvement of radio, television, and film technology. And finally, the advancement of the scientific field of psychology, in part thanks to Sigmund Freud, helped people better understand themselves and increased the interest in dreams, insanity, and the mental state that was so important to symbolists like Munch and later Expressionists. Fauvism was a short-lived movement that was greatly inspired by the post-Impressionists and that very much resembles the Expressionist movement that originated in Germany around 1910. The name Fauvism comes from the French word fauve, or wild beast, and draws reference to the wild, unrestrained use of color and free-flowing brushstrokes to create these unique and colorful paintings. The Fauves aimed to not only use color in new and powerful ways, but to change the way paintings were viewed, by drawing stark contrasts to the illusionistic naturalism of Academy painting. They took the techniques of the post-Impressionists to an extreme, and painted color as a subjective experience, that is to say, something that is experienced differently by each person, and their use of color reflects the individual artist's experience of the subject. Durand, a notable Fauvist, described his colors as sticks of dynamite, and the juxtapositions of the different hues as deliberate disharmonies. We can see here in the Turning Road that he uses largely primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, with hints of their complements, some green and orange, to create a lively, colorful, almost fantastical landscape. The bright vermilion and deep blue of the trees give us a sense of bright light illuminating their surfaces, while the multicolored treetops generate a visual energy, though it is far from naturalistic. In Matisse's The Joy of Life, we can see not only the wild and fantastical hues and thick, flat chunks of color that are characteristic of Fauvism, but the influence of several artists and styles before him. The most direct inspiration is perhaps Gauguin's work, such as Mahana no Atua, which we looked at during the last lecture. Gauguin's bold, unnatural use of color, along with the layout of the scene itself, with the naked bathers, was a clear inspiration for Matisse's work. Matisse was also inspired by idyllic scenes of nude lounging muses from the Renaissance period, as well as Orientalist paintings of harems, full of nude women reclining, bathing, and playing instruments. Art being produced at this time is almost always referencing back to art of the past, and will continue to do so throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Pablo Picasso was an artist who was very important to the birth of modernism in the 20th century. Originally from Spain, he was a child prodigy who mastered Academy painting at a young age. By 1900, he had moved to Paris and had been greatly inspired by the avant-garde movement. During this early period, he tended to travel around and paint the social outcasts of society, such as this family of saltimbanques, or traveling acrobats. Instead of painting the entertainers performing, like Degas and his dancers, Picasso preferred to show their lives outside of entertainment, the lonely and often melancholy existences of people with these lives. This first painting is from his Rose period, so named because of his prominent use of pinks during this time. He also had a period of painting labeled the Blue period, because of his prominent use of blue. Here, he also painted outcasts of society, the use of blue injecting a strong sense of emotion, loneliness, coldness, sadness, into these melancholy compositions. Cubism is a movement that is largely defined by the abandonment of a single perspective. Instead, artists aim to represent subjects from multiple perspectives or angles. The name cubism comes from the artist's use of simple geometric shapes and interlocking forms that give the figures an unnatural, angular feeling. Naturalism diminishes in this movement over time in favor of abstraction. The leading artist of this movement, Pablo Picasso, was a primitivist, like some of the postmodernists before him. He had an interest in African tribal art, seen here incorporated as masks on the nude figures of the prostitutes, but he had no appreciation for or understanding of any of these tribal societies. Like Gauguin and the Tahitians, he saw these societies as simpler and less civilized than the Western world, and that their undeveloped, primitive nature made them fascinating subjects for art. Like Gauguin, we also see an inherent sexuality associated with these cultures. Cubism, while a progressive movement for visual culture, was also very much infused with the racist and colonialist perspectives of primitivism. See how we have what at first glance seems to be a misunderstanding of perspective and space? Like those Northern Renaissance paintings we looked at in the beginning of the semester, where the rooms and tables looked like things were falling off of them? We have here, instead, an intentional rendering of space in a weird way. What Picasso and the other early Cubists are trying to do is to capture things from multiple angles at once, as though you were walking around a scene and observing it from every different perspective. They were very inspired by film and early animation that showed the human body and other scenes in motion, and wanted to find a way to capture that in a two-dimensional context. Other proto-Cubists, or early Cubists, clearly took inspiration from a variety of other post-impressionist styles, such as pointillism. In Severini's piece, however, the points of color are not used as much to trick the eye into blending the colors, but are more about dividing the painting into chunks, or fractured segments, which is further emphasized by the jagged triangular shapes that all of these dots fit into. As we said, a major goal of Cubism was to impose a rigid structure onto a subjective, abstract image, to fracture it into pieces and combine several different viewpoints or perspectives. A lot of the early Cubist paintings look very different from each other and draw inspiration from different sources, but have this aspect in common. The German painter Franz Marc, along with his Russian friend and fellow painter Vasily Kandinsky, ushered in the Expressionist movement. This is a pretty general term that encompassed a lot of different styles, ranging from naturalism to total non-representational abstraction, but all of the artists aimed to use color in a way that was totally expressive, not drawn from nature, but rather a reflection of the emotion and sometimes spirituality of the artist. In the large blue horses, Franz Marc has rendered the creatures in overlapping circles, echoing the waving, colorful landscape of rolling hills behind them. This is naturalistic enough that we can see that they are horses, but all else has been distorted. Marc used blue frequently in his paintings, as it was a color he associated with spirituality. In this later, more abstract piece entitled Rehe im Walde, or Deer in the Woods, it is even harder to distinguish the subject. We can clearly see the influences of early Cubism in the angular, geometric divisions of the composition. Franz Marc's distinctive use of rich, contrasting colors brings new life to his compositions, and we can really see how beautiful and valued nature and wild animals were to him. Wild animals tended to be his most frequent subject matter. Vasily Kandinsky is another expressionist painter who is considered by many a pioneer of abstract art. Some of his early work, such as Munich Schwabing with the Church of St. Ursula shown here, clearly takes on expressionist form. Here, a common composition, people enjoying a nice day at a park with an industrial background, has been utterly transformed by the otherworldly, unnatural colors that have been used in the scene. The neon green of the grass, the bloody red of the water, the deep cerulean of the sky, and the sickly yellow-green smoke rising from the buildings infused this painting with life and action. As Kandinsky's career went on, he continued to move towards abstraction, not only in his use of colors, but in the forms and lines themselves. This scene shows an industrial cityscape, but is hardly recognizable as such with the large swaths of overlapping, bright colors. During our next class, we'll look at some more expressionist paintings, as well as the later work of Kandinsky, which becomes entirely abstract and non-representational. To review, the early 20th century was a time of great turmoil and societal change in Europe and America. This is reflected by the many creative, emotional, different art styles that came out of this time period. They were all very heavily influenced by the work of the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists that came before them, and laid the foundation for art that continued to reference the art historical past, while pushing expression and abstraction in a way that had not been explored before.